The court had spoken of the Alpha King in hushed, terrified tones. They claimed his flesh was liquefying into black bile, that his very presence carried the sweet, heavy scent of a tomb. Aurelia St. gripped the heavy iron rings of the Obsidian Citadel's gate, her knuckles white. She had been sent here as a final, discarded offering by a fiancé who wanted her gone, and she had spent the long carriage ride preparing for the worst, a man already halfway to the afterlife, surrounded by the stench of failing organs and inevitable death. When the towering doors groaned open, she held a scented veil tightly over her face, bracing for the miasma. But as she crossed the threshold into the king's private chambers, the air was sharp, cold, and unnervingly sterile. There was no rot,
No dica.
no death rattle echoing against the vaulted obsidian ceilings. The room was bathed in the flickering, golden amber of hearth fire, revealing a space that was not a chaotic sickroom, but a fortress of iron and ink. "I expected a funeral," she murmured, her voice steadying as she let the veil fall. "I was told I would be tending to a corpse." From the shadows near a wall of jagged stone, a figure detached itself. The Alpha King, Draven Vane, moved with a lethal, predatory fluidness that belied his reputation as a bedridden invalid. He was tall, his frame corded with hard muscle, dressed in midnight-hued furs that clung to his broad shoulders. But as the firelight caught him, Aurelia's breath hitched. His skin was not rotting, but it was patterned, strange, vine-like fractures of iridescent violet, and obsidian silver pulsed faintly along his throat and carved sharp lines across his high, royal cheekbones. He looked less like a man dying of a plague, and more like a man being consumed by a power he was desperately trying to cage. "You were lied to, St. Clair," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that prickled against her skin. "I am not here to be mourned. And you," his gaze narrowed, pinning her with an intensity that made her feel instantly, dangerously seen, "are not here to be a witness." Aurelia's spine locked. Percival had promised her a simple life of quiet caretaking for a dying man, but standing before the pulsing, lethal grace of Draven Vane, she realized the truth. She hadn't been sent here to nurse a king. She had been sent here to be the final nail in his coffin, or to become the only one who could save him. Aurelia stood in the center of the king's chambers, the silence of the citadel pressing against her ears like a physical weight. Draven Vane remained motionless near the hearth, the strange, iridescent markings on his neck pulsing in rhythm with the dying embers. The deception felt like a physical blow to her chest. She had been sent here under the guise of an act of mercy, a noble duty to ease a dying man's final transition. Now, the bitter reality of Percival Thorne's opportunity began to take shape, and the cold calculation behind his supposed generosity was finally laid bare. She looked at the king, noting the way his eyes tracked her movements with a wariness that suggested he had seen many such gifts sent to his door before. He was not the broken invalid Percival had described in his polished, persuasive tones. He was a man being hollowed out from the inside, forced into a prison of his own court's design. Aurelia's thoughts raced, connecting the gaps in Percival's stories, the urgency to have her leave, the strange insistence that she remained attached, and the way he had spoken of the king's impending end as if it were a guaranteed date on a ledger. "He told me you were fading," Aurelia whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast, shadowed room. "He said the kingdom needed someone to bear witness to the end of the Vane line." Draven's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his intense, amber eyes. "Percival Thorne has always been ambitious, but he is also a fool. He does not want a witness, Aurelia. He wants an executioner." The truth landed with the finality of a closing tomb. Percival hadn't just traded her away to secure a business advantage. He had used her as a tool to finalize a coup. If she were present when the king inevitably succumbed to his symptoms, she would be the perfect scapegoat, or perhaps the final leverage needed to silence the remaining loyalists. Percival intended to step into the power vacuum the moment Draven ceased to breathe, legitimizing his claim by absorbing the king's remaining assets and titles. Aurelia felt a cold, sharp shard of resolve pierce through her initial shock. She had spent 7 years sharpening her mind to serve Percival's petty interests, unknowingly helping him build the very platform he now intended to use to erase the monarchy. She looked at the man before her, the king who was supposed to be a corpse, and realized that for the first time in her life, she had a target for her intellect that was actually worth the effort. She wasn't going to be the final witness to his death. She was going to be the architect of his survival. Draven moved toward a heavy mahogany table, his movements fluid and intentional, as if he were testing the limits of his own strength. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, the scent of oak and something metallic drifting through the room. Aurelia remained where she stood, her posture rigid, refusing to let the intimidation of his presence dictate her reaction. She had spent years navigating the treacherous egos of men like Percival. She knew that fear was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. "You look at me as if I am a broken mechanism," Draven remarked, his voice cutting through the quiet. He offered her a glass, his gaze searching her face for the cracks he likely expected to find. "Most people who enter this room offer prayers or pity. You offer me scrutiny." Aurelia took the glass, her fingers brushing against his cold skin, but she did not drink. She set it aside, unyielding. "I am not here to offer you either, King. I am here because I have been discarded, and you are currently the only man in this kingdom who realizes that the game we are playing is rigged." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "Percival believes I am a nurse who will watch you wither. If you want me to remain, I will not be a shadow in your hallway or a servant at your bedside. I possess an understanding of this court's ledgers and the secret channels of Percival's influence that you currently lack." Draven set his own glass down with a sharp clack. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of 2 people measuring the cost of trust. He was an alpha whose power was being eroded by shadows, and she was a strategist whose value had been erased by a man who didn't deserve her loyalty. "You ask for a seat at a table that is currently crumbling," he said, though his posture had shifted, the predatory alertness sharpening into something more calculating. "I am asking for the tools to reinforce it," Aurelia countered, her voice steady. "I know the patterns of his ambition better than anyone. Let me work within your inner circle. Give me access to the records the physician guards so closely, and I will show you exactly how he plans to dismantle your throne. Keep me as a silent nurse, and I am just another pawn for him to move. Treat me as an advisor, and I am the only person in this citadel who is actively working to ensure you survive the night." Draven leaned back, his shadows stretching long against the obsidian wall. The violet markings on his throat flared for a fleeting second, a silent testament to his internal struggle. "You are reckless, Aurelia St. he murmured, his eyes holding a spark of dark amusement. "But reckless is precisely what this dying kingdom requires." The following days within the Obsidian Citadel were marked by a tense, silent rhythm as Aurelia inserted herself into the mechanics of the king's existence. She moved through the corridors with the quiet precision of a ghost, mapping the routines of the household and the strict, suffocating regimen imposed by Dr. Alistair Finch. It became immediately apparent that the Citadel was not a place of healing, but a gilded cage where the king was kept in a state of controlled lethargy. Aurelia began her work in the kitchens and the apothecary storage, using the pretext of managing the king's nutritional needs to infiltrate areas that had previously been forbidden to her. She watched the servants with a hawk-eyed focus, noting how the physician personally supervised the preparation of every tincture and broth delivered to the royal chambers. It was a tedious, painstaking process, but her years of managing Percival's chaotic business affairs had given her an eye for minute discrepancies that most would overlook. One evening, while examining the dregs of a tonic left on a side table, she noticed the faint, metallic residue clinging to the crystal glass, a sharp, copper-like scent that did not belong in a mixture of honey and willow bark. She cross-referenced the ingredients she found in the storage logs with the state of the king's morning tea. The frequency of his episodes of weakness aligned perfectly with the consumption of specific, concentrated drafts. More damning still was the timing. The physician arrived exactly 1 hour after these doses were administered, often finding the king in a state of labored breathing or listless confusion. It was not a decline of the body, but a chemical suppression of the king's vitality. The patterns in the ledger were meticulous, yet they contained subtle, repeated adjustments to the dosage that didn't correspond to any recorded changes in his condition. Each adjustment served only to lower the king's threshold for physical exertion. Aurelia sat in the dim light of the library, the ledger open before her, her blood running cold as the full scope of the sabotage revealed itself. The king was being kept on a slow, measured descent into oblivion, not by any curse or incurable decay, but by the very hands entrusted with his life. She had the proof of the interference now, a trail of poisoned breadcrumbs leading directly to the doctor's desk, and she knew she had to act before the next dosage was poured. The game had moved from the shadows into the light, and for the first time, she held the advantage. The atmosphere in the Citadel shifted the moment Dr. Alistair Finch returned from his rounds, his sharp eyes instantly narrowing as he found Aurelia organizing the king's medical logs. He swept into the room, his long, dark coat billowing like the wings of a scavenger, and stood over her with an air of practiced, lethal authority. The warmth of the hearth seemed to vanish as he leaned down, his voice smooth but edged with the jagged promise of a blade. He did not waste time with pleasantries, instead making it clear that her presence in his domain was an affront he would no longer tolerate. He suggested, with a thin, mocking smile, that a woman of her status should be far more concerned with the decor of the drawing room than the complexities of royal pathology. His attempts to sideline her were calculated, designed to make her feel small and dangerously out of her depth, as he pointedly snatched the ledger from her hands. He spoke of delicate conditions and professional boundaries that she, in her ignorance, had repeatedly violated. He made a thinly veiled threat that her interference was not only a breach of etiquette, but a direct threat to the king's fragile equilibrium, implying that if she continued to play doctor, she would be held personally responsible for any sudden failure in Draven's health. Aurelia remained seated, her hands clasped calmly in her lap, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the tremor of genuine anxiety behind his calculated cruelty. He was not just defending his profession, he was defending his lifeline. He warned her that the king's moods were volatile and that her persistence was agitating him, painting her as a disruptive element in a room where she was meant to be invisible. He went as far as to suggest that he would speak to the court about her erratic behavior, hoping to intimidate her into submission through the threat of social ruin. Yet, as he loomed over her, Aurelia realized his hostility was the clearest confirmation of her theories she had yet received. His mask of professional arrogance was cracking under the weight of his own secrets. She met his gaze with a cold, unwavering focus that seemed to catch him off guard, refusing to cower before his posturing. She knew now that he viewed her not as a nuisance, but as an existential threat to his carefully constructed deception. As he turned to leave, promising to rectify her situation, Aurelia felt no fear, only a sharpened resolve. She was no longer just an observer in this game. She had become the player he most feared, and the physician's overt hostility was the signal that the end of his influence was finally within her reach. With Finch's warnings still echoing in the cold, silent halls, Aurelia retreated to the sanctuary of the king's private archives. She knew the physician would be watching for any further intrusion into his medicinal stores, so she shifted her focus to the history of the king himself. Hidden behind a row of crumbling political treaties, she discovered a small, leather-bound portfolio that had clearly been omitted from the official royal record. These were the notes of a former healer, dating back to the years before Finch had arrived, detailing the initial onset of the king's strange condition. Aurelia spread the documents across the table, the candlelight dancing over diagrams that mapped the king's vitality. As she cross-referenced these forgotten entries with her own observations of the last 2 weeks, the truth emerged with terrifying clarity. The king's suffering was not a steady, natural decline. It was a precise, synthetic rhythm. The symptoms, the listlessness, the erratic fever, the labored breathing, did not flare at random intervals. They spiked every time a specific tincture was administered, followed by a secondary period of induced collapse that served no purpose other than to drain his remaining strength. The early notes described a king who was once robust, his constitution described as ironclad and resilient, capable of recovering from battlefield wounds that would have claimed a lesser man. There was no mention of a degenerative disease, only a sudden, unexplained shift in health that coincided perfectly with the introduction of Finch's predecessor. Aurelia's hands trembled as she realized the sophistication of the cruelty at play. The physician was not just suppressing the king, he was curating a slow, agonizing erasure, using chemical triggers to mimic the progression of a chronic illness. It was a masterpiece of malpractice, hidden in plain sight. The cycle was unmistakable. When the king's body showed signs of fighting back, the dosage was increased to force the symptoms into a new, more debilitating phase. She marked the dates in her own notebook, mapping the spikes in pain and the corresponding shifts in the king's daily routine. She finally understood why Finch had reacted with such visceral hostility when he found her with his ledgers. He wasn't just protecting a treatment plan, he was protecting a crime. Every ounce of his care was a calculated strike against the king's life, a way to keep him perpetually on the threshold of death, without ever crossing it. Aurelia closed the portfolio, her resolve hardening. She no longer had to guess the nature of the rot in the Citadel. She had the blueprint of the murder attempt, and it was signed in the physician's own meticulous, damning hand. The Obsidian Citadel fell into an uneasy slumber, the corridors stretching out like skeletal fingers beneath the flickering moonlight. Aurelia knew the physician's quarters were strictly off-limits, guarded by both the threat of royal decree and the lingering terror of Finch's reputation. Yet, fueled by the damning patterns she had decoded in the archives, she moved through the shadows with a singular, icy focus. Reaching the heavy, iron-bound door of the physician's study, she did not hesitate. She relied on a master key she had carefully lifted from a distracted steward's belt earlier that evening. The lock clicked with a soft finality that made her breath catch, and she slipped inside. The room smelled of stale herbs, cold ash, and something sharper, a pungent, chemical tang that lingered in the back of her throat. It was an environment of intense, fanatical order, with vials arranged in rows like soldiers and parchments detailing every stage of the king's slow dissolution. Aurelia navigated the darkness with practiced care, avoiding the scattered papers that might betray her presence. Her fingers danced over the heavy oak desk until they brushed against a hidden latch, a mechanism so subtle it would have eluded anyone not looking for a secret. With a muted groan, a panel in the desk slid open, revealing a collection of sealed canisters tucked deep within a velvet-lined recess. She pulled one out, the glass cold against her skin. Inside sat a dark, viscous substance that seemed to absorb the meager light, pulsing with a faint, iridescent hue that mirrored the strange markings on Draven's neck. This was it, the architect of the king's decay. It wasn't merely a poison. It was a stabilizer, a catalyst designed to tether his body to a state of permanent, agonizing transition. As she uncorked the vial, the scent of crushed nightshade and rusted iron filled the room, confirming her suspicion that Finch had been sourcing his materials from the forbidden ruins beyond the kingdom's borders. The weight of the discovery was immense. She had the proof needed to dismantle the physician's reign of terror, but as she pocketed the vial, the floorboards behind her creaked. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, as a sliver of light from the hallway began to widen against the floor. She had seconds to vanish back into the shadows before Finch discovered his sanctuary violated. With her pulse thundering in her ears, Aurelia slipped toward the heavy velvet curtains, the evidence of the king's salvation tucked tightly against her chest, knowing that if she were caught now, there would be no trial, only the same slow, agonizing end he had prepared for the king. The vial felt like a lead weight in Aurelia's pocket as she retreated into the relative safety of her own chambers. The iridescent liquid was not merely a poison, it was a binding agent, anchoring Draven's vitality to a state of artificial rot. She spent the remaining hours of the night hunched over the journals she had scavenged, her mind working with a feverish clarity that transcended exhaustion. The logic of the antidote was hidden in the very toxicity of the compound itself. A slow purge would only agitate the bindings and accelerate the king's collapse, but a sudden, massive system shock, a controlled, total body fever, could force the agent to release its hold on his nervous system. She meticulously drafted the protocol, listing the rare botanical catalysts required to spike the body's temperature to the brink of death. It was a terrifying strategy, one that carried as much risk of ending the king's life as saving it. If the dosage of the catalysts were off by even a fraction, the resulting fever would consume his heart before the poison ever broke. She found herself checking and rechecking the ratios, her hands steady despite the sheer audacity of the plan. This was the only way to bypass Finch's influence and purge the years of chemical interference in one singular, agonizing strike. She realized she could not involve the servants or the court. Their loyalty was too easily bought or too deeply fractured by fear. She needed Draven to be both the patient and the partner in this lethal gamble. When the morning sun began to bleed over the jagged skyline, she gathered the necessary herbs from the palace gardens, working under the pretense of preparing restorative teas for her own health. Every step felt like walking a razor's edge. She was essentially preparing a weapon, a concentrated dose of heat that would act as a crucible for the king's survival. She mapped out the timing, aligning the purge with the hour Finch was known to be occupied with the council meetings. It had to be done in total isolation, with the king's personal chambers sealed against intrusion. As she measured the final root extract into a ceramic bowl, Aurelia took a steadying breath. She had spent a lifetime being a pawn, someone else's move in a game she hadn't chosen, but this was different. This was a calculated strike, a desperate act of defiance that would either restore a sovereign or leave her standing over the wreckage of a failed rebellion. She had the protocol, she had the catalyst, and for the first time since arriving at the Citadel, she possessed the singular, terrifying power to turn the tide. The king's life, and her own future, would be decided in the crucible of a single, unrelenting night. The air in the king's chambers was thick enough to choke on, smelling of damp herbs and the sharp, ozone-tinged scent of the volatile catalyst Aurelia had prepared. Draven lay sprawled across his bed, his skin no longer pale but mottled with the violent, pulsing violet of the purging toxin. Outside, the Citadel was in total disarray. News of the physician's sudden, suspicious absence had leaked, and factions of the court were clashing in the halls, their shouting muffled only by the thick stone walls of the master suite. Aurelia slammed the heavy bolt shut just as a fist hammered against the door, the sound echoing like a death knell. She didn't look back. She had to focus on the king, whose body was currently caught in a horrific battle between the stabilizing poison and the induced, blistering fever she had triggered to burn it away. Draven's tremors were so violent they rattled the frame of the bed. He was burning, his internal temperature rising toward a fatal threshold, but Aurelia kept her hand pressed firmly against his chest, monitoring the erratic, stuttering rhythm of his heart. "Hold on," she commanded, her voice fierce, though she knew he could barely hear her through the haze of agony. The fever was the only way. It was a total body crucible, designed to force the poison out through the pores of his skin, and if his resolve faltered, the poison would win. Every minute felt like an hour, punctuated by the sounds of the siege beyond their sanctuary, the clatter of steel, the desperate commands of guards, and the encroaching chaos of a throne in peril. Suddenly, Draven's back arched, his scream tearing through the room as the violet markings on his neck flared with a blinding, searing intensity. The toxin was fighting back, desperate to anchor itself into his blood. Aurelia grabbed the cold, wet linens she had prepared, wrapping them around his torso to prevent the fever from liquefying his organs, while she fed him the bitter, concentrated extract that acted as the final catalyst. For a terrifying second, his eyes went blank, his breathing halted, and the silence in the room became absolute, save for the chaos raging just outside the door. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered, her hands gripping his shoulders as she channeled every ounce of her will into his recovery. Slowly, agonizingly, the violet light began to recede, turning from a burning neon to a faded, dull gray. His chest shuddered, a long, ragged inhale tearing through his lungs, and his eyes focused, dark and clouded with residual pain, but undeniably alive. The poison had been broken, purged in the crucible of a single, unrelenting night. As the door to the chamber groaned under the weight of the siege, Draven finally reached out, his hand closing over hers with a grip that held the strength of a king restored. The morning light that filtered through the high, arched windows of the Obsidian Citadel was no longer the oppressive, suffocating gray of a sick room, but a piercing, golden clarity that promised a new reign. Draven stood by the window, the lethal, iridescent markings on his skin now nothing more than faint, fading shadows of a nightmare he had finally survived. The fever that had nearly claimed him had also burned away the last remnants of the physician's chemical chains, leaving behind a man who moved with the restored, predatory power of an alpha king. Below, in the courtyard, the clamor of the siege had dissolved into the disciplined silence of a court forced to reckon with its own treachery. Dr. Alistair Finch was led across the stone slabs and iron shackles, his face a mask of broken arrogance as the royal guards stripped him of his authority. The evidence Aurelia had gathered, the journals, the hidden canisters of toxin, and the meticulously kept ledgers of the king's decay, had been laid bare before the council, leaving no room for the physician to hide his malice. He did not beg, he only watched with dead, hollow eyes as his influence was dismantled piece by piece. In the great hall, the reckoning for Percival Thorne was swift and final. He stood before the throne, his polished armor looking pathetic against the backdrop of the Citadel's formidable stone, his attempts at justification silenced by a single, icy look from the man he had intended to replace. Draven did not grant him the mercy of a trial. He was stripped of his titles, his lands were forfeited to the crown, and he was permanently exiled from the kingdom, sent into the desolate reaches of the northern wastes, where his ambition would find no soil to take root. Percival left not as a conqueror, but as a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost his future to the very pawn he had once discarded. When the dust of the transition finally settled, the citadel felt transformed, the air itself lighter, stripped of the pervasive rot that had defined it for so long. The court knelt, not out of the performative duty they had shown the fading king, but out of genuine, tempered respect for the partnership that had saved the throne. As Draven took his place at the center of the dais, he turned to Aurelia, his hand extended in a gesture that was both a request and a command. She stepped forward, her own resolve mirrored in the gaze of the man who now stood as her equal. She was no longer the pawn traded by a jealous fiancé, nor the nurse serving a dying master. She was the architect of a sovereign's survival, and as the crown was placed upon her brow, she knew she had finally found the agency she had spent a lifetime seeking, side by side with a king who valued her intellect as much as he prized her heart.